Ilara stood on the porch of the house her father had built, a place that was no longer hers. She was 26 years old, and the world had been hollowed out around her, first by fever, now by law. The air was still thick with the scent of pine from the forested claim, a smell so deeply woven into her memory that she felt its absence would be a kind of suffocation. She did not cry. She did not plead. Her Uncle Marcus had made it clear this was not a negotiation. It was an administrative finality. He stood beside the sheriff, a man whose silver star seemed to mock the clear morning sun. "The deed is clear, Ilara," Marcus said, his voice as dry as the dust on the road. He avoided her eyes, focusing instead on a document held by the sheriff. "Your father's name is on it, but with no listed heir, the property reverts to his next of kin for disposal. That's me, and I've disposed of it." The sheriff, a man named Cobb with a face like worn leather, shifted his weight. He had known her father, had shared coffee with him in this very house, but today he was just an instrument of the law Marcus wielded. "I'm sorry, miss," he mumbled, the words a perfunctory stone dropped into the well of her grief. "The new owners want possession by noon." Ilara's gaze drifted past them, to the workshop where her father had spent countless hours. It was there he had taught her the language of wood and stone, the immutable truths of a level line and a plumb-true wall. He was a surveyor by trade, but a craftsman by soul, a man who believed that competence was a form of prayer. He had taught her to read the grain in a piece of timber, to mix mortar that would outlast the men who spread it, to find north with a stick and a shadow. He had taught her that the world could be measured, understood, and if necessary, rebuilt. She had learned it all: how to use an adze to shape a beam, the satisfying rasp of a dovetail, saw cutting its clean line, the quiet intelligence of a vernier scale. While other girls her age were learning stitches, she was learning joinery. While they practiced pleasantries, she practiced patience, watching her father work with a silence that was a form of deep communion. Her uncle held out a small, thin envelope. "This is the remainder of the estate, after debts. It's more than fair." Inside were a handful of bills, $50, the price of a life's work, of a home, of a future. It was an insult wrapped in the guise of closure. Ilara took the envelope without a word, her fingers brushing against the cold, official paper. Her silence seemed to unnerve them more than any outburst would have. It was the silence of a deep place they could not reach. She turned and walked back into the house. The rooms were already ghostly, stripped of the small comforts she and her father had shared. She went to the heavy oak mantelpiece he had carved with the shapes of pine cones and oak leaves. From it, she took the one thing she truly claimed as her inheritance. It was her father's plumb bob, not a simple teardrop of steel, but a heavy, intricate thing of solid brass, turned on a lathe with a watchmaker's precision. It was warm from the morning sun, its weight a familiar comfort in her palm. It was a tool for finding the true vertical, for aligning a structure with the silent, pulling heart of the world. For her, it was a compass for the soul. She slipped it into the pocket of her canvas coat. In a worn leather satchel, she packed a change of clothes, a block of hard cheese, a small whetstone, her father's hand-forged carpentry axe, and a coil of good rope. The rest of the tools, the saws and chisels and planes, she had to leave behind. A new and specific ache joined the larger, duller one in her chest. Leaving the tools felt like leaving a part of her father's body. When she stepped back onto the porch, Marcus and Sheriff Cobb were waiting, their impatience a palpable thing. She walked past them, down the steps her father had set into the earth, and did not look back. The dust of the road puffed up around her worn boots, and with each step, the scent of pine began to fade, replaced by the anonymous smell of the open road and the sharp metallic tang of loss. The journey was a blur of dust and sun. She walked for 3 days, heading west, away from the familiar hills and into the high, arid plains. She slept in the lee of rock formations, the heavy brass plumb bob a cold companion against her hip, a reminder of a fixed point in a world that had come unmoored. The $50 felt like both a pittance and a fortune, a fragile shield against a world that had already proven its indifference. She ate sparingly, her grief a hard knot in her stomach that stole her appetite. The landscape grew harsher, the trees thinning out to scrub and stone. The sky was immense and empty. On the fourth day, she limped into a dusty settlement that was little more than a county office, a general store, and a blacksmith's forge clustered around a crossroads. Her feet were blistered, her throat raw. She bought a loaf of bread and a canteen of water from a dour-faced woman at the store, and sat on the steps to eat, listening to the conversations of the men who came and went. It was there she first heard of it. 2 ranchers were leaning against a hitching post, their voices carrying on the dry wind. "Heard the county is finally trying to offload Breaker's Folly," one said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. The other man laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "Folly is right. Thorn's Folly. Who in their right mind would buy that pile of rocks? Cursed, they say. The whole valley is sour." "Cursed with bad water and bedrock a foot down," the first man corrected. "No good for grazing, no good for farming, and that old fort is a death trap. County clerk's been authorized to sell the deed for taxes. $10, I hear, just to get it off the books." Alara's head came up. $10. The name Thorn echoed faintly in her mind. Her father, a student of the region's history and surveys, had mentioned it once. Captain Elias Thorn, a surveyor and engineer for the old railroad expansion, a man who had designed a series of small, defensible outposts along the proposed route, a route that was never built. She finished her bread, the dry crumbs scratching her throat, and stood up. She walked across the dusty road to the county office, a small clapboard building with peeling white paint. Inside, a balding clerk with ink stains on his fingers sat behind a tall wooden counter, looking bored. "I'm here about a property," Alara said, her voice hoarse. The clerk looked up, his eyes taking in her dusty clothes and worn-out boots. A flicker of amusement crossed his face. "Which one?" "The one they call Breaker's Folly, in the valley west of here." The clerk's amusement bloomed into a full, patronizing smile. "That one? Little lady, you don't want that pile of rubble. The land is worthless. The structure is condemned. The deed isn't worth the paper it's printed on." "Is it for sale?" she asked, her voice steady. "For back taxes, yes," he said, still smiling. $10, and you'd be a fool to pay it." He seemed to be enjoying this, the absurdity of a young, destitute-looking woman inquiring about the county's most infamous piece of worthless real estate. Alara reached into her satchel and pulled out the envelope from her uncle. She carefully counted out $10 and laid the bills on the polished wood of the counter. The clerk's smile faltered. He had expected her to balk, to be scared off. He had not expected the quiet finality of her gesture. "You're serious," he said, his tone shifting from mockery to disbelief. "I am," she replied. He sighed, a long, theatrical sound of a man burdened by the foolishness of others. He pulled a heavy ledger from a shelf and blew a cloud of dust from its cover. He thumbed through the pages, his finger running down a list of forgotten claims and failed homesteads. "Breaker's Fort, Section 4, Thorn Valley," he muttered, finding the entry. "All right. It's your money to waste." He filled out the deed with a scratchy pen, his movements slow and deliberate, as if to give her one last chance to change her mind. He signed it with a flourish and slid it across the counter. "Sold. All 160 acres of rock and ruin. No refunds." Alara took the paper. The ink was still wet. It felt heavier than the $10 she had paid for it. It felt like a chance, however slim. She folded it carefully and placed it in her satchel. As she turned to leave, the clerk called after her, his voice dripping with condescension. "Good luck with the ghosts, Missy. Captain Thorne is said to still be looking for his lost gold." She did not grace him with a response. She walked out of the office and back into the unforgiving sun, the deed a small, square weight in her bag, a counterpoint to the heavy brass plumb bob in her pocket. She had $40 left, a piece of paper that declared her the owner of a ruin, and a set of skills nobody believed a woman could possess. It would have to be enough. The valley was another day's walk west, and the path was little more than a game trail. The entrance was a narrow cut between two towering mesas of red rock, a place the wind never ceased to scour. As she passed through the gap, the temperature dropped, and the air grew still. Thorn Valley opened before her, a long, narrow bowl of land walled in by steep cliffs. The ranchers had been right. It was not a gentle place. The ground was stony, covered in tough, wiry grass and hardy, low-lying shrubs. A thin creek, barely a trickle, snaked its way down the center, its banks lined with more rock than soil. And at the far end, nestled against the sheer cliff face of the valley's terminus, stood the fort. Breaker's Fort. Thorn's Folly. From a distance, it looked like a natural outgrowth of the cliff itself, a jumble of stones that had tumbled down and come to rest in a vaguely geometric shape. As she drew closer, the ruin resolved itself into something man-made and utterly defeated. The outer wall, a dry-stacked curtain of local stone, had crumbled in a dozen places. The main gate was gone, its massive timbers rotted into the soil. What might have been a watchtower was now a conical pile of rubble. A wave of despair, cold and sharp, washed over her. The clerk's mocking laughter echoed in her ears. This was not a structure. It was a quarry. She had traded the last of her hope for a pile of rocks. She sank onto a large, flat stone, the satchel sliding from her shoulder. The silence of the valley was absolute, broken only by the whisper of the wind, moving through the ruins, and the frantic beating of her own heart. For the first time since leaving her home, she felt the sting of tears. She had been so determined, so focused on the simple act of moving forward, that she had not allowed herself to feel the true depth of her desolation. Now it threatened to drown her. She sat there for a long time, watching the sun creep across the sky, her gaze fixed on the ruin. She thought of her father. What would he do? He would not despair. He would assess. He would measure. He would find the foundation. Slowly, she got to her feet. Wiping the moisture from her eyes with the back of a dusty hand, she slung the satchel over her shoulder and walked toward the rubble. She would not be beaten by a pile of stones. She began to walk the perimeter, her boots crunching on fallen rock. She ran her hands over the remaining sections of wall, feeling the quality of the masonry. It was dry stacked, yes, but masterful. The stones were chosen and fitted with an expert's eye, locking together with a precision that had defied a century of neglect. Even in ruin, the competence was visible. Inside the crumbling walls was a central courtyard, now choked with weeds and debris. Around it stood the ghosts of several buildings. A barracks, its roof long gone, its walls bowing outwards. A smithy, identifiable by a collapsed stone forge and the scattered rusted heads of hammers. And then, built directly against the back cliff, was a larger structure, the commandant's quarters or office. A portion of its roof, made of thick stone slabs, was still miraculously intact, held up by one enormous solid wall that was part of the cliff itself and two stoutly built stone partitions. This would be her shelter. Hope, a small and fragile seedling, pushed its way through the despair. It was not a house, but it was a roof. She entered the space cautiously. It was dark and smelled of dust, damp stone, and the dry, papery nests of long-gone creatures. The floor was buried under a thick layer of debris. Wind-blown dirt, fallen plaster, and stones from a collapsed interior wall. But the main structure was sound. The back wall was the mountain. The two side walls were 3 feet thick. The stone roof above looked immovable. She spent the rest of the day clearing a small area, using her hands and a flat piece of slate as a shovel. As she worked, a methodical rhythm took over, pushing thought aside. Scrape, lift, toss, scrape, lift, toss. The physical labor was a balm. By dusk, she had cleared a 10 by 10 foot square down to the original stone flagstones. They were rough, but level. She unrolled her bedroll in the cleared space, ate the last of her cheese, and lay down as darkness filled the valley. Above her, through a gap in the collapsed front wall, she could see a sliver of the night sky, glittering with cold, indifferent stars. She was the sole inhabitant of Thorn Valley. She was home. The next few weeks were a blur of labor. Her first priority was to make her shelter secure. She used rubble from the courtyard to painstakingly rebuild the collapsed front wall of the room, leaving openings for a door and a small window. She had no mortar, so she emulated the original builder, choosing and fitting the stones with painstaking care, using smaller chinking stones to fill the gaps and lock everything into place. Her hands, already calloused, became tough as leather. Her muscles, hardened by years of helping her father, rediscovered their strength. During her work, she explored every corner of the ruin. She was not looking for treasure. She was conducting a survey just as her father would have. She was assessing the bones of the place, understanding its strengths and weaknesses. She found the well, choked with debris but showing signs of a deep, stone-lined shaft. She found the remains of a sophisticated drainage system, cut into the bedrock to channel the meager creek's overflow away from the fort's foundations. Captain Thorne had been no fool. He had been a master engineer. It was while clearing the last of the rubble from her new home that she found it. The collapsed interior wall had once contained a large fireplace, its archway now a jumble of fallen voussoirs. As she was moving the heavy, soot-stained stones, she noticed one that was different. It was the keystone. Where the others were rough-hewn sandstone, this one was a smoother, harder granite, and while it was covered in soot, one edge, protected by the stone that had fallen next to it, showed no sign of the fire blackening that marked its neighbors. It was almost as if it had been added later. Curiosity piqued. She stopped her work. She ran her fingers over it, feeling its texture. It was a perfect, precise wedge, its surfaces smoother than they needed to be for simple masonry. She tried to budge it, but it was locked tight. She fetched her father's carpentry axe and, using the flat back of the head as a hammer, began to gently tap the stones around it, trying to loosen the immense pressure of the collapsed arch. For an hour she worked, tapping and prying, listening to the subtle shifts and groans of the stone. Finally, she felt something give. One of the adjacent stones moved a fraction of an inch. She worked her fingers into the gap and pulled. It came free with a grinding protest. Now there was a space beside the granite keystone. She peered into the darkness, but saw only more stone. Reaching inside, she felt the side of the keystone. It was perfectly smooth. And in its center, her fingers found a small, round indentation. Her heart began to beat faster. It was a finger hold. She hooked her fingers into it and pulled. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a low groan of stone on stone, the granite block began to slide inward, not falling, but retracting into a hidden cavity in the massive chimney breast. It moved on some long-forgotten mechanism, a counterweight or a simple track, a secret designed by a brilliant engineer. When it had slid back 2 feet, it stopped. It revealed not a gaping hole, but a small, tightly sealed iron box, nestled in a perfectly carved niche within the stonework. The box was about a foot square, bound with iron straps and coated in a thick layer of dust and grime. Its front bore a heavy, complex-looking lock. There was no keyhole. Ilara stared at it, her breath catching in her throat. The clerk's words came back to her. "Good luck with the ghosts, Missy. Captain Thorne is said to still be looking for his lost gold." This was no ghost story. This was engineering. This was a puzzle. She examined the lock. It was not a key lock, but a combination lock of some kind, made of 3 concentric brass rings set flush with the iron. Each ring was marked with degrees, like a compass rose. A compass. Her father had been a surveyor. Thorne had been a surveyor. She thought of the tools of the trade: a compass, a transit, a sextant. She thought of coordinates, of bearings, of declinations. The combination would not be random numbers. It would be a location, a date, something significant to the builder. But what? She sat back on her heels, the dust motes dancing in the single shaft of light from her window. She felt an odd kinship with the long-dead Captain Thorne. He had built this place, and she was rebuilding it. He had hidden something with skill and precision, and she would have to use her own to find it. She pulled her father's plumb bob from her pocket. The heavy polished brass felt cool in her hand. It was a tool of truth. She looked from the brass tool in her hand to the brass rings on the box. An idea began to form. A surveyor's work is tied to the stars, to the magnetic north, to the fixed points of the universe. What if the combination was not a place on a map, but a place in the sky, or a fundamental constant? She thought back to her father's lessons, the quiet hours in his workshop, where he explained the principles of navigation and survey. He had spoken of the Polaris, the North Star, and its azimuth. He had talked about magnetic declination, the difference between true north and the north a compass needle points to. That value changed depending on your location and the year. It was a specific, knowable number. She had no charts, no almanac, but she remembered her father explaining how to find true north using the sun and a stick. And she had his plumb bob, a tool for finding the true vertical. Perhaps Thorne had left a clue. She began to examine the room again, not as a shelter, but as a map. She looked at the flagstones, the walls, the window she had rebuilt. Her gaze fell upon the single massive lintel stone above the new doorway she had framed. It was a single piece of slate, 10 feet long, and on its surface, almost invisible in the dim light, were a series of faint, deliberate scratches. She ran her fingers over them. They were not random. They were markings, a line and another line intersecting it, and a series of smaller marks, like degrees on a protractor. It was a sundial, a crude, simple, but functional noon mark. When the sun was at its highest, a shadow cast from a specific point would fall directly on the main line. The next day, she waited for noon. She hung her plumb bob from a small nail she had driven into the ceiling, its point hovering a hair's breadth above the floor. As the sun climbed, she watched the sliver of light from the window move across the room. When the shadow cast by the window jamb aligned perfectly with the main scratch on the lintel stone, she marked the spot on the floor directly beneath the point of the plumb bob. That was true south. From there she could find true north. Then she would need magnetic north. She improvised. She took a sewing needle from her small kit and carefully, painstakingly, magnetized it by stroking it repeatedly against a piece of lodestone she found in the creek bed, a naturally magnetic rock. She floated the needle on a leaf in a cup of water. It slowly, tremulously, swung to point to magnetic north. The angle between the line she had drawn on the floor, true north, and the direction the needle pointed was the magnetic declination for this exact spot. It was just over 14 degrees. She went back to the iron box. 14 degrees. It was a number. She turned the first brass ring to 14. Nothing. She tried the other rings. Nothing. She felt a pang of disappointment. It had felt so right. She sat and stared at the box, her mind racing. What was she missing? Thorne was an engineer. He would be precise. 14 degrees was an approximation. He would have used the exact value for the year he built this. Then she saw it. Tucked into the grimy space around the rings of the lock, almost invisible, were a series of tiny, stamped letters. Her heart leaped. On the first ring, DSC declination. On the second, LAT, latitude. On the third, YR, year, declination, latitude, year. She had the declination, or a close guess. The year, she had no idea. But the latitude, a surveyor would know his latitude to the inch. He would have marked it. It was a point of pride. Where would he mark it? It had to be somewhere permanent, somewhere foundational. She went outside and began to examine the fort's cornerstone, the very first stone laid. It was a massive block of granite at the northeast corner of the outer wall, larger than all the others. It was covered in lichen and the grime of a century. She spent the rest of the afternoon scrubbing it with a stiff brush she made from yucca fibers and water from the creek. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the valley, the stone was clean, and there, carved with a master's hand, were the figures: 38 degrees, 55 minutes 12 north, the latitude. She memorized the numbers: 38, 55, 12, but the ring on the lock was a single dial from 0 to 360. It wouldn't be 3 numbers. It would be 1. She converted it. 38 degrees. But what about the minutes and seconds? An engineer would be more elegant. Then it hit her. He wouldn't use the whole number. He would use the significant part, 38. So she had declination, 14, latitude, 38. Now, the year. She had no way of knowing. She began to try combinations. 14, 38, and then she started with the years she knew Thorne had been active: 1870, 1871, 1872. With each turn of the third dial, her hope dwindled. The lock remained stubbornly shut. Exhausted and defeated, she sat with her back against the cool stone. She looked at the numbers carved on the cornerstone: 38, 55, 12. Why those numbers? Why so precise? And why were they on the northeast corner? Surveyors begin from a known point. Maybe the numbers themselves were the key: 38, 55, 12. She went back to the box. She turned the first ring to 38, the second to 55, the third to 12. With a soft, metallic click, the lock disengaged. For a full minute, she did not move. She simply stared at the box, her mind struggling to catch up. It was not declination, latitude, and year. It was latitude, minutes, and seconds. A simple, elegant code hidden in plain sight. She let out a long, shaky breath. With trembling hands, she lifted the heavy iron lid. The clerk had been right about the gold. The box was lined with oilcloth, and nestled inside were stacks of gold coins. Double eagles mostly, bright and gleaming as the day they were minted. She counted them slowly, her hands shaking. There were over 500 of them. $10,000. A fortune beyond her wildest imaginings. But beneath the coins was something else, something more valuable. It was a leather-bound journal, its pages filled with neat, precise handwriting. The first page read, "The Journal of Captain Elias Thorne. If you are reading this, then you are a finer student of stone and shadow than those who betrayed me, and this valley is now yours." Tears she had refused to shed for herself now flowed for this stranger, this kindred spirit. She sat in the fading light, the gold forgotten, and began to read. Thorne's story was one of quiet competence and bitter betrayal. He had been partners with a powerful man in the railroad venture, a man who had taken Thorne's brilliant designs, secured the funding, and then, using falsified reports of geological instability, had the route changed, leaving Thorne's forts to rot and bankrupting him in the process. It was a story of administrative violence, of being erased by a pen stroke. It was her own story, written in a different hand. He had retreated to this, his finest and most remote creation, with the last of his personal funds, the gold in the box. He lived out his days alone, not in bitterness, but in a state of quiet communion with the valley. He wrote of the seasons, of the way the light fell on the cliffs, of the hawk that nested in the high rocks. He had not been a ghost haunting a ruin. He had been a guardian. The final entry was dated 20 years after the first. "The walls are true," he wrote. "I have found more peace in this valley of stone than I ever did in the world of men. But a valley is not meant to be a tomb. It is meant for life. The gold is a tool, nothing more. The real treasure is the water in the well and the soil that can be made from this rock. Use the tool. Make this valley live. Do not let the fools win. Let this be a place of competence and quiet dignity. That is my last will and testament." Alara closed the journal, holding it to her chest. The weight of the gold was nothing compared to the weight of this legacy. She was not a squatter in a ruin. She was the heir to a kingdom of stone, the chosen successor to a quiet king. That night, she did not sleep in a shelter. She slept in a fortress. With the dawn came not just light, but purpose. Thorn's words had rekindled a fire in her. The gold is a tool. Her father had taught her that the right tool makes any job possible. Now she had the ultimate tool. The first thing she did was walk back to the settlement. It took her a day, but she walked with a new stride, a new certainty. She went not to the county office, but to the general store and the blacksmith. At the store, run by the same dour woman, she did not buy a single loaf of bread. She bought sacks of flour, beans, and salted pork. She bought nails, a new shovel, a good hammer, and 2 thick wool blankets. She paid in cash from the $50 her uncle had given her, saving the gold for bigger things. The woman, whose name she learned was Martha, watched her, her expression shifting from suspicion to a grudging respect. "That's a lot to haul to the Folly," Martha said, her first unsolicited words to Alara. "I plan on staying a while," Alara replied. Martha nodded slowly. "I run a freight wagon. Make a run out past the fork twice a month. For $1, I can drop that at the valley entrance for you." It was the first crack in the wall of her solitude, an offer of practical help, not charity. "I'd appreciate that," Alara said. Next, she went to the blacksmith's forge. The smith was a mountain of a man named Silas, his face perpetually smudged with soot, his arms thick as tree limbs. He was shoeing a horse, the ring of his hammer on the anvil, a constant, rhythmic heartbeat for the small town. Alara waited patiently until he was done. He turned to her, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a leather-gloved hand. "What do you need?" His voice was a low rumble. "I need my father's axe head rehung, and I need to buy a good crosscut saw, a froe, and a set of chisels." Silas looked at the axe she presented. He took it, his big hands surprisingly gentle. He examined the steel head, noting the maker's mark. He ran a thumb over the blade. "Good steel. Your father had a good eye." He looked at her, truly looked at her for the first time. "You're the girl who bought the Folly." It was a statement, not a question. "I am," she said. "Folks say you're a fool." "Folks say a lot of things." A slow smile spread across his sooty face. "That they do." He handed the axe back to her. "I've got a good saw I can sell you. Used, but the steel is true. I'll throw in the chisels. You bring me a straight-grained piece of hickory for the handle, and I'll hang that axe for you. No charge." It was a trade, a recognition of shared values. She knew wood, he knew steel. It was a language they both understood. "I'll do that," she said. With her new supplies arranged for delivery and a new saw in hand, she returned to the valley. The work began in earnest. Inspired by Thorn's journal, her first major project was the well. It took her a week to clear the debris, hauling up rocks and dirt with her rope and a bucket. 10 feet down, she hit mud. 20 feet down, she hit clear, cold water. Thorn had known. He had built his fort on a deep, reliable aquifer. The ranchers who called the valley sour had never bothered to dig. Next, she turned to the fort itself. She began the long, methodical process of restoration. She became a student of Thorn's work, dismantling collapsed walls, not as demolition, but as deconstruction, learning how he had notched and placed each stone. She built a small stone cart with wooden wheels she hewed herself, allowing her to move the larger blocks. She mixed her own mortar using her newfound knowledge of the local geology, finding a vein of clay near the creek that, when mixed with sand and slaked lime, she painstakingly rendered from limestone rocks in a kiln of her own making, created a binder nearly as strong as the stone itself. She started with her own quarters, mortaring the walls she had dry stacked, framing a proper door and window casings from timber she felled and shaped herself. She rebuilt the fireplace, setting the granite keystone back in its place of honor, though its secret was now her own. She repaired the roof, quarrying new stone slabs and setting them in a thick bed of her clay mortar. Her work was noticed. One afternoon, an old man appeared at the valley entrance. He was thin and wiry, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, and he carried a long rifle. He introduced himself as Jedediah, a trapper who had worked these hills for 50 years. "Seen your smoke," he said, his voice a dry rasp. "Figured I'd see who was foolish enough to move into Thorne's place." He looked around at the partially rebuilt walls, the cleared courtyard, the neat stack of firewood. His eyes, sharp and intelligent, missed nothing. "You ain't foolish," he concluded. "You're busy." He became a regular visitor. He knew the valley's secrets, where the bitterroot grew, how to predict the weather by the clouds on the western ridge, the migration paths of the deer. He taught her to set snares, to read tracks. In return, she offered him a warm place to sit by the fire and a hot meal. He never asked for anything, and she never offered charity. It was an unspoken compact of mutual respect. With Silas's tools and Jedediah's knowledge, her world expanded. She built a small barn in the courtyard, using timbers from the collapsed barracks, shaping them with her adze and joining them with pegs she carved herself. She bought 2 hardy cows and a bull from a rancher miles away, paying with Thorne's gold. The ranchers closer by had laughed, but these cattle thrived on the valley's tough grass. She fenced in a pasture with stone walls, a monument of patience. She cultivated a small garden, enriching the rocky soil with river clay, mulch from the creek bed, and manure from her cattle, just as Thorne's journal had suggested. Things grew. News of her progress trickled back to the settlement. The mocking clerk fell silent. Martha, the freight driver, started bringing her mail and news from the outside world, always with a fresh loaf of bread tucked in as a gift. Silas would make a trip out once a season to check on her, bringing a new tool or a piece of hardware he had forged, always finding some small repair she could do for his wagon in trade. A community was forming, not of neighbors, but of allies, a web of competence and quiet support that spanned the lonely miles. The test came with the second winter. It arrived not with gentle snows, but with a sudden, violent blizzard that descended from the north like a white wolf. The wind howled through the notch at the valley entrance, a sound of pure fury. The snow fell so thick and fast that the world beyond her walls disappeared. But inside her restored home, the fire in Thorne's fireplace burned bright and warm. The walls, now 3 feet thick and solid with mortar, did not tremble. The roof did not leak. She was safe, an island of warmth and light in a sea of frozen chaos. On the 3rd day of the storm, she heard a faint sound above the wind, a desperate shouting. She pulled on her heaviest coat, wrapped a scarf over her face, and fought her way to the gate she had built. Through the blinding snow, she saw them, a wagon, one wheel shattered, and a family huddled beside it. It was a man, his wife, and 2 small children, their faces numb with cold. They had been trying to reach a relative's homestead and had been caught by the storm. "We're freezing," the man stammered, his beard caked with ice. "The axle broke." "Come," Alara said, her voice calm and steady. She led them back into the fort, into the warmth of her home. She settled them by the fire, wrapping the children in her wool blankets. She gave them hot stew from the pot that was always simmering on the hearth. The woman wept with relief, and the man looked around the solid stone room, at the well-stocked shelves, with disbelief. "We thought this place was a ruin," he said. "It was," Alara replied. "I fixed it." They stayed for a week, until the storm broke and the world re-emerged, buried under a deep blanket of white. The blizzard had been one of the worst in memory. The roads were impassable. The towns were isolated. But in Thorn Valley there was warmth and food. Alara's small herd of cattle, safe in their stone barn, were healthy. Her root cellar was full. She had not just survived the storm. She had prevailed. When the man and his family finally left, after she and he had worked together to build a new wheel for his wagon, they left as friends, promising to return. She had done what Thorn had asked. She had made the valley a place of life, a place of refuge. 2 more winters passed. The valley was transformed. The fort was no longer a ruin, but a home, its walls a testament to her labor. The herd of cattle had grown, fat and healthy on the unique grasses of the valley. The garden was larger, producing enough to preserve for the winter. The community of allies had strengthened. Jedediah now spent his winters in a small room she had rebuilt for him. Silas had a standing order for her hickory wood. Martha's freight line considered the fort its most reliable western terminus. One late autumn afternoon, as the sun cast a golden light on the valley walls, 2 riders appeared at the entrance. They were not friends. They wore the uniform of the county sheriff. Her heart gave a familiar, cold lurch. For a moment she was 26 again, standing on a porch that was no longer hers. The riders were young deputies, their faces chapped by the wind. They looked nervous as they rode into the courtyard and dismounted, their eyes wide at the sight of the restored fort, the healthy cattle, the general air of order and prosperity. It was not the ruin they had been told about. One of them, the senior of the 2, stepped forward, holding his hat in his hands. It was a gesture of respect she had not expected. "Ma'am," he began, his voice hesitant, We're from the sheriff's department. Sheriff Cobb's men." Alara stood on her porch, her arms crossed. She did not speak. She simply waited. "The thing is, ma'am," the deputy continued, stumbling over his words, "the winter looks to be a hard one. The blizzards last year took a toll on the herds down in the flatlands. There's talk of a beef shortage in town before spring." He took a deep breath. "Sheriff Cobb sent us to ask if you'd be willing to sell some of your cattle for the town." The irony was so thick she could have cut it with a chisel. The law that had cast her out was now coming to her for sustenance. The man who had stood by as her life was dismantled was now asking for her help. She thought of her uncle, long gone, of the mocking clerk, of the laughing ranchers. She thought of Captain Thorne's words, "Do not let the fools win." She looked past the deputies, at the valley that was hers, her fortress, her home. It was a place built not on bitterness, but on competence. It was a testament to the idea that the best revenge is not vengeance, but a well-built life. A slow smile touched her lips, a smile that held the warmth of her hearth and the hardness of her stone walls. "I have a few head I can spare," she said. "The price is fair, and you'll have to haul them yourselves." As she watched the deputies lead the cattle away, a deep, quiet contentment settled over her. On the mantelpiece inside, her father's brass plumb bob sat next to a small, intricately carved wooden bird she had found at the back of Thorne's journal, a forgotten whittling project. One was an inheritance of skill, the other an inheritance of spirit. Together they were the foundation of her life. The $10 she had spent in that dusty office, the money the world had deemed wasted, had been the best she had ever spent. It had bought her more than a pile of rocks. It had bought her a kingdom. It had bought her herself.